Welcome to our PRBI live session today. I'm your host, Tarunjit Ratan, and today we host our PRBI member, Juris Petersons, on a live session. Juris is the co-founder of Jazz Communication from Latvia and will speak to us about how boutique firms can continue to stay relevant in the new normal. Before we add him on, let me tell you a little bit more about him. Juris co-founded Jazz Communications with Linda in 2008, and since then, they have been active in the Latvian market with clients and projects in the Baltic region and Germany. The Jazz team specializes in crisis communication management and comprehensive communication strategy, and Juris is directly responsible for strategy and crisis communication. Before starting his journey as a PR entrepreneur, he also worked with clients independently and has served as the country executive of corporate communication for Philip Morris in Latvia. He holds a degree in international relations with a double master's in new media and communication and another in global challenges. He will discuss with us today on how, how smaller agencies can stay relevant in the fast-changing media and PR landscape. So let me add him on. How are you doing?
I am doing great. Hey, Tarunjit, thank you for having me.
We're very lucky to have you here with us. It's been quite a crazy year for all of us. So before we start, for the topic for the chat, we would like to know more about your journey in PR. I mean, how did you get started?
I guess it was kind of a logical step-by-step process. I started my studies in political science and continued with international relations. So on a certain level, the continuation in working for a communication agency or for a communication position at an international company was kind of the introduction that led me in the right direction, and then in all honesty, there is nowhere back. And I mean, all credit due to Philip Morris. Of course, it's a very sensitive, sensitive industry, and at the same time, that's why they do a fantastic job in preparing the people for the roles that the people have in communication. So we always used to joke that in Latvia, where I come from, Philip Morris is the best professional school in producing PR people in the country. So, and that's in fact true. So that's kind of the very outbreak for how I ended up in communication, and then everything else then went down the road. I decided to leave the job at Philip Morris after 3 years there, and I started my first micro company in consulting in public relations. But as they always say, it's the third company that works best. For me, it's now Jazz Communications is second, and it took me a really long time to convince my partner Linda to come on board, because she was an extremely successful managing director of a larger PR agency in Riga in Latvia. But once we put the foot on the floor and we started Jazz Communications in 2008, so we've been around for the better half of 12 years, and never looked back. So far so good.
That's awesome. So why did you decide to become a PR entrepreneur? You know, that's not an often a usual so-called space for people from corporate communication. Yeah, there are different challenges that one is presented with, especially when you become an entrepreneur in the PR space. So why did you decide to become an entrepreneur?
Honestly, I do not have an elegant answer to that. At the same time, I think a lot of it has to do with the size of the market that Latvia has. You have around 2 million people. The country is not too small. It's maybe 2 times bigger than, it's twice the size of Belgium. But with that relatively little amount of people who live here, in the end, you have only a very set amount of opportunities. And also then for my work at Philip Morris, it ended up being the situation whether I take it to the next level and go and work abroad. But I had just returned from my studies at an American university beforehand, So the decision together, when we started a family as well, and our first child was born. So in the end, the decision was made that I stay put in Latvia, which in essence, that either I look for along the same line for a bigger challenge there, or you start something on your own. And I guess we were young enough to go to choose option 2. So in the end, this is what I stayed.
Completely understand. I mean, for me as well, this is our 13th year in business. So pretty much started around the same time. So, when you moved from the corporate field to starting your own firm, I'm sure there were a few shocks in place. There were a few learnings in place, right? What were your biggest learnings in your first year of business?
Well, it was quite some time ago, but I think there were 3 things I learned very fast. One of them is, and that was something that one of my former bosses also told me beforehand, is that the relationship should be cultivated, which is another way of saying that, without the people around you and without the networks and without the understanding of how the mind of your client functions. So basically, in the end, it means without listening, it's a very tough world to live in, especially if you're in PR, I think. And that was one of the things that I learned, that if you become sloppy there, then it's much harder to catch up again later. And I think that was largely kind of learning on the field experience for me as well with the first company. And that's something that I've taken with me down the road. The other lesson that I definitely learned was that you need a partner, and I think that's that's something that most of our PRBI members have already probably thought to themselves many times. Is that, I mean, this is not the industry where you can do it alone, and as long as you have the right partner, your odds compared to larger agencies increase tremendously. And the third thing, which was, I suppose, if people are preparing for entrepreneurship, that's something that they read somewhere. I honestly didn't do it, but in the end, I ended up finding it the hard way. You really have to sell something before you buy something, because otherwise, if you start doing it the other way around, you probably will find yourself in trouble. And that's obviously has nothing to do with PR. That's true for any type of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, that's very valid.
With JazzCom, with Jazz Communications, we've definitely been successful in doing that. So far.
That's very sane advice, and I'm glad somebody shared that with you at the start of starting up. So how did you bag your first client? What was it like? What was that experience like?
This is, again, it might be that in our conversation I have to come back to this several times, and it has to do with the way that that Latvia is. I mean, you have the capital Riga, which is almost half of the population, and half of the economy is concentrated in one place.
Right.
So with that, and at the same time, everything being small enough, what you have much shorter distances, not geographical, but you have shorter distances where you have to get acquainted, build your network, start to talk to people, start to get to know people, start to meet the right people, in terms of understanding who are the people who are making decisions and get to know them. That really kind of shortens the time period that you need to get to start to get to start to have things moving. And our first client arrived already on the first month, and it was it was technically coincidence. It was another conversation that we were having together with my partner, with Linda, with an acquaintance of ours, and it was just a direct recommendation, and it was basically one email where we were put together with our first client. Funny enough, I guess funny enough is not the right word, but interesting enough, they are still our client. We still have them, and it's a very interesting organization. They are the waste management field or waste management part for Riga City. They started out as many of them did, as a waste, you could say, waste dumping site, and they've really turned everything around. They're now based, because you have the methane gas that is produced by waste. They use it to heat greenhouses and grow tomatoes. They're doing all kinds of very interesting things. So for us as a PR agency, it's been an amazing journey just to see them grow and actually tell their story along the way. And that's something that's probably the most fun part about it. If you can go long term, if you can stay with a client, and that I know that there are many times when agencies say, "Oh, okay, this is an excellent field. We do a campaign and everything is done. We get paid, and that's the end of the story." That's something that we have deliberately tried to not put the best or the most emphasis on. Well, I would say until 2020, because as we all know, some of the things are changing. So there's definitely many things that we have to look into the future as well.
Interesting. It's really nice to hear that your first client that you started with today is still with you. Yeah, that speaks a lot about the kind of work that you put into the client. So before we come to 2020, the big question. Help us understand, what is the media and PR landscape like in your country? How is it different? How is it similar from other landscapes, across the world?
Mm-hmm. Again, one of the things is the size of the market. So when you're considering budgets, the budgets are usually smaller, especially in the private sector, than you would be used to, for example, if you're working in Germany or if you're working in Poland or the countries that are closer to Latvia. On the other hand, that's why you have larger competition with for the public sector, because the countries, for example, getting EU funding for all kinds of projects, and then there's a lot of communication involved as well. So the public tenders is a place where some of the battle happens. I mean, to be very honest with you, the situation is such that I think that a clear-cut or kind of a very well-defined free and open market doesn't exist for the sheer lack of size, which means that you may have a situation where you have, I don't know, you have a tender, a company is asking for a specific service, and it defines it obviously in the brief, and you have agencies coming and proposing their take on that brief. And in terms, for example, on the financial side, the range can be quite extraordinary. I think that there's one legendary case from 2014, I think, where in the end there were 11 proposals from agencies, and the range in finance, in the financial breakdown, was between 9,000 euros and 60,000 euros. So I mean, you can imagine. Of course, we're beyond that point. I mean, the last 6 years have been better in terms of that, but that's something that it's kind of a very extreme illustration of how things can shape out, depending on the client, depending also on the way that you approach things and how you position yourself. For the second part of the question, if we look at the agencies, there's a lot of agencies that say they are PR agencies, and then it's, again, I mean, we have to understand that Latvia is, as a country, the renewed independence is only 30 years old. So many things, even though they seem to be established, from a larger perspective or from a more competitive perspective, especially if we look at the region, not only Latvia, they are still evolving. And it's also on the client side. So I would still maintain that the understanding of the clients of what communication and PR means and how it is beneficial to me as a company, for example, is still up, it's still up in the air in many cases. And of course, you have the more established, larger companies who have a more in-depth understanding, and then you have the smaller ones, which are have a very short, kind of a very narrow take on that.
Interesting. So do you have to spend a lot of time explaining to them what PR is and how it can help them in building a reputation?
Absolutely, and that's something that it's nobody's fault. I mean, the idea that, and as I'm sure we will be talking about later on, the field of public relations in general is expanding, and it's in many ways changing and developing, and that's something and that's when we come to the topic of today's discussion. That's something that is really really important if we want to stay relevant. I think that the smaller, the more boutique agencies have a better short-term chance in facilitating that change, and being more agile in many cases. All the decision-making process is taking less time, and things that can be decided and done differently much faster is always helpful. But that's something where we always have to keep in mind that we want to, you don't want to, while you are running, you don't want to lose the client on the way. And as long as we can, and that's the only reason, that's the main reason why I think that explanation part, taking the time to sit down and say that, oh, it's not just we have the perfect strategy for you, but actually, talking about the audiences, talking about why we're choosing this platform for communication and this timing, and how that's relevant for the larger picture and for the business. Now I'm starting to sound a bit like a textbook, but it is relevant especially in the cases where companies don't need that to spend all the time themselves on issues that are related to communication. That's also, I think, the service that still makes us relevant in doing that kind of that education of the whole field. I'm betting here that it's the same way with you and the same way in India as well.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. For there is a small bracket which understands PR, knows how to leverage it to build a reputation. But for the majority part of it, we do have to sit down and help them understand what it is about. We are also taking an initiative, within the country itself to help the larger audience understand what PR is about. Because when we meet a lot of clients, for them, PR is equal to coverage, right?
Yes.
And
absolutely in the right place. If you're not on TV, you do not exist. So.
Correct. So we have to help them understand that coverage is the final product of everything that you put in together, and it might or might not happen, but a reputation definitely can be built. So we spend a lot of time actually doing that. While I understand what the PR landscape is like, what is the media landscape like in your country? For example, in India, we have around 1 lakh newspapers, print newspapers that exist. Yes, this year has been tough for them. A lot of them have shut down supplements. A lot of them have gone bust. But still, it has seen, there has been a surgence of independent media that has cropped up, right? So they're pretty much balanced numbers. And I think thousands of news channels that exist, lots of portals that exist. So there is a lot of scope when a client says coverage. Yes, there are a lot of mediums that we can look at. What is the media landscape like in your country?
In numbers is very poor, especially if you compare it with India for obvious reasons. I think that, also for an audience of 2 million or less, there is about 4 or 3-4 TV stations, and which are also relevant on a national scale. There is quite a number still of print newspapers that are, as you rightly say, and I think that's been relevant for the last 5 to 10 years or so. Many of them are struggling in terms of coping with the changes that are coming with the digitalization, with all the opportunities to involve the audience, involve the reader, and make it relevant, also for businesses, while you have that juggling process of and making ends meet and the falling advertising income and all of that. So that's definitely relevant here. In terms of numbers, we have less shutdowns, of course. It's interesting enough, there is still a relevant audience, and there is interest on the business side in developing new papers or new publications, which are not daily papers but print magazines. I think to an extent the weekly paper is having sort of a revival, and I think that's in many cases also outside Latvia where I've been looking into. I think it's relevant because of that simple truth that on the one end of the scale you have the fake news, you have the extremely fast digest content and coverage, which always then is obviously coming with its own set of interesting side effects. And on the other hand, you have really what you would be able to call analytical journalism, that you would be able to call critical writing and more long form. And that's I can say that it's becoming relevant for the weekly paper, because obviously you need time to make it happen. At the same time, you need time to read it. So obviously it kind of narrows down to that time frame of 1 week, where I see that many publications are picking up speed, and I think that's excellent. I think and I think it's that you have that chance to actually pick up good content. It's also very relevant for us as a PR company, so we can say, look, if you want to bring your point across to a targeted audience, if you want to not speak to everybody, but have the right people, the people who matter to you, if you want them to read it, this might be a good chance to do it. And because there is some demand for it, that's also the reason why they actually managed to still be relevant and still exist. I think that's one interesting take. And then, of course, in terms of the media landscape, then you have the online portals and online everything. They still have their challenges. I think that for the bigger ones, I'm very happy to see that many of them are working on making content more relevant, of better quality. Because they see the difference. Also, I would suspect that they see the difference in numbers. I mean, if you have the 3-line headlines, if you have all the stuff that is not relevant or not digestible while you're online, then you are probably losing viewers, and all the integrations with the social networks and the social debates that are going around. That's something that we see that is becoming. The quality is going up, not always, obviously, and especially your clients always see that, in our case, this is not the best, this is not the best outcome. We should have had a better tagline or a better headline. But I mean, it's all part of the process.
Yeah, that's interesting. So coming to your firm, how has 2020 been for you, and how have you managed to stay ahead of the curve?
It's been challenging, but I don't think that's anything new. I don't think. In this case, I think 2020 has been the year where, and that obviously is one of the reasons why the headline is the way it is also, and why it is us talking about these type of changes that are happening in 2020. It's relevant. The idea that you have a smaller agency, you can make the decisions faster, you can go over everything that is relevant for you much faster, you can evaluate how you're servicing your clients, what is still remaining valid for the client, and what new venues you have to pursue. It's happening. I mean, in that sense, you're more agile and more dynamic. So I think for us, we're definitely doing better than larger companies, be it PR field or, in fact, any type of business. Of course, you have certain industries that are faring better than others, and let's not talk about tourism. So these are realities that everyone is facing. For us, it's been a review of what we're offering the clients, how we're approaching the business. We're starting to see quite a serious shift from what you would have monthly fees and going into project type of spending, doing investments, for example, in specific outcomes, and then making also when you're planning the budget, you have the base budget for that you can easily call, the technically necessary budget, and then on top of everything, the outcomes define then the end remuneration, which I think is very valid. I think it's for many agencies, it's also a very therapeutical experience, you could say. But I think that's something that we're going, and that will be part of the new normalcy, as we call it here. And I think that is something that many people will have to wrap their heads around. That you will have to be able to measure much better what is it that you're delivering, and you're completely right in saying that it can't be that we didn't get into this publication, or we didn't come on air for this specific segment, and still understand that how we're building the long-term reputation, how we're building the relationships that matter, and then what are the tools to do it. These are the major challenges that we've had, and so far we've done a very good job in managing them. So let's see how 21 looks like.
No, of course, it'll go well on that. You mentioned that this is a great time, to be boutique in the short term. Obviously, during the pandemic, a lot of them have benefited because of lesser overheads, faster turnaround time. But what's your view on a long-term perspective? You mentioned this is a short-term perspective, right? In the long run, what do you see the agency of the future like? Is it going to be more boutique in nature? Is it going to be a mammoth, multinational PR agency that will exist? What do you think? I would say, who do you think is best suited to survive in the long run?
It can go both ways, and I think it will obviously depend case by case. This is a very PR answer, I know, but in general, in general, I think it will make sense to consolidate. It will make sense in many cases because the local markets, based on what's changing, will not be the same local markets that you're used to. What I mean by that is that many also boutique agencies, many smaller agencies will have to look beyond national borders. It obviously may not be as relevant to India, but for example, for very small markets like Estonia or Latvia, we've been discussing it with our PR partners as well, and we see that the projects that go beyond national borders, and I think that's what the pandemic has shown, is that in fact, it's much easier, it's much more doable than anyone would have ever expected because of the sheer lack of alternatives. That you don't have to be present everywhere. You don't have to be, in the location. You can do many things from a distance. There are in fact many tools that already exist that can help you, do project planning and management much better and much more effectively than you thought before. I mean, obviously everyone has to step out of their comfort zone, but I think what we're stepping into means that many things are doable, and where national borders are already, less relevant. With that in mind, and that obviously asks for a bit of a consolidation down the line. If this is one of the things that I want to bring up at some point, and well, I'm bringing it right now, but with the PRBI, with our colleagues, is that perhaps it is a valid idea that we should think if we can do service-specific teams that are pan-border. Perhaps there is a way that, and I know the competences that we have, and there's excellent people in all of them. So making teams that are working regardless of the geographical location, but doing service teams for specific services such as strategy building or such as design. And I think that's something where, and I think that's like networks like ours are much better equipped in going in that direction. I think we have all the tools that we'll need. I still think we should meet next year in Amsterdam for sure. But apart from, besides that, I think we have opportunities in this new normalcy and going down the road to make things happen, that where you have these teams that can solve especially for pan-national clients that can solve many things very effectively, and many
Interesting idea on that. So, in the last 6 months, the last 9 months, let's put it that way, what have you done? How have you pivoted? What have you added to your skill set that has helped you remain relevant?
It's interesting. We've done media training on video, which
Okay.
didn't happen before. So distant. There is definitely a new additional investment in skill sets such as managing video editing, managing all those practical things that are on growing demand because of the changes in how information is going around and how people are communicating. So that's something that has been relevant. On the other hand, Latvia is probably not the best example in doing extremely rigorous changes, because the pandemic hasn't really hit us hard at all until recently. Now we're getting the numbers are picking up, but I mean, the only place where you need a face mask in Latvia is the public transportation and public offices. So the rest of the country is still open. So and with very little restrictions. But again, I think that the major things that will, the major skill sets that we will need will, fortunately or unfortunately, have to do with the computer and how you operate it and what exactly you do, so that you can deliver effective services for clients. That's one thing for sure. I would say there is some learnings in these past months that we definitely have seen, and one of the things that is coming back big time is what I started with as one of the things that I learned as an entrepreneur very fast. It's the relationships, and I think the human side of everything. And obviously, you have the pandemic, which logically brings out the human side of many things.
Right.
At the same time, you can see that these type of relationships as such, and the way that you do business, not as much as you achieve, but rather how you collaborate, how you do things, and how you treat the people around you, especially, obviously the clients and the media, and everyone's having a tough time. These things definitely matter, and this is something where you cannot, go easy on it at any point of time. The second thing, as I mentioned, was that I was thinking about that specialization and national, that I think is relevant, and we see that that's something that will be helpful down the road. And there is one very simple one: it's making decisions. And until 2020, many things were being postponed. That's something that we see everywhere. I mean, it's like, you don't need to do this now. I mean, you can do it later.
True.
Or you can, I mean, maybe this may be a project that you can put on hold, or this campaign is not valid. But starting to make better decisions, making them faster, more informed, that's something that will, as simple as it sounds, the decision-making process in general will be something that will make a huge difference down the line. This is one of the learnings from this year.
I completely agree. For us as well in India, I think the digital transformation that has happened to the PR business has been phenomenal. For the last decade or so, we've been talking about digital PR,
Yeah.
And yet clients were very reluctant, brands, even PR agencies themselves were very reluctant to, jump onto that particular bandwagon. But I think last 6 months has accelerated that growth. I think what we would have seen 5 years from now has happened in 5 months. That's one. And second, the way we do business, you're correct. The way we do business has been one of the biggest changes. Everything goes digital, and keeping that human side has been the challenge. So, I did read about it on your website as well and on your profile that you also specialize in crisis communication, and that's one of the fields that you specialize in. So in the last 6 months, share with us a case study or share with us an example of a brand that you work with, which has seen successful crisis management from you.
I can. At the same time, obviously, there are several things that I have to keep out of the case study confidentiality reasons. But the time when the crisis really struck, and for Latvia it was the 13th of March, when the decision was made to enact all the restrictions and regulations that came for almost everyone in the spring. The other side of the story was that you had a lot of cases where both the public and the private sector was struggling in coping with the restrictions and changes, which meant, the huge demand for face masks, huge demand for medical equipment, and so on and so forth. And it turned out that no one really know what's you didn't have the best case studies at that point of time, and we had cases where we had companies that approached us that were working on delivering, for example, face masks, and and in EU you have these regulations which are quite strict in terms of how these type of procedures are being dealt with, and we had a case where there was a shipment of, I think this everyone has heard the news on one time or another, where there was a shipment of face masks, and there was some there was some doubt whether the ones that were being shipped are the ones that were being ordered, and then you have the public sector on one side and the private sector on the other side. And with that in mind, then the task that we had was to go through the data, go through the process, that the one that is public, and see what exactly had happened, where which certificates were being made. It was a very interesting experience, and as we always have it in PR, you have that learning curve, which is extremely steep, and that if you can't keep up with it, you just fall. And 2020 has been, one of the tougher years in that sense. And what we arrived in the end was a very clear-cut plan as to how we go through the process of what had happened with the masks, what the certifications are, how they are being managed, and we were doing the laboratory testings together. The client was doing the laboratory testings, and then it was the whole communication step by step, how you introduce all of that information first to the customer and then to the public as well, because these were essential. The situation was crucial not only for that specific deal, but for how the country and how the region is dealing with these new challenges in general. And in the end, the debate has calmed down. There is clear understanding of what is being done. There is clear understanding of how the process is being handled. And I think that the outcome is that you didn't, in Latvia in general, you didn't have big panic about whether we have enough, whether we have enough food, whether we have enough face masks, or whether we have enough equipment. Until now, I think also the public sector has done a fairly good job in explaining what's being done and how the crisis is being handled. And we had, in this crisis, unfortunately, it's not ours, but the most brilliant line that I read in terms of communication of when the crisis struck was by the Association of Latvian Farmers. And what they did, they basically put out one sentence. They said, "No worries, we can feed everyone." And I think that was, and this is exactly and this is the type of precision and type of communication that was really relevant for that crisis situation, and that's been handled well. So, in that sense, there have been more smaller issues with companies having to deal with, obviously, with the additional stress with working from home, explaining to larger teams of their employees of how to do things differently. And we have been quite instrumental in planning that new type of communication for some of the clients. And that's been a very rewarding experience, because I think that I do not know a company that has closed down because of COVID. There have been, yes, in the tourism sector, there is serious problems, for the restaurants and for the hospitality industry in general, and some of the hotels closing down, but in our immediate client circle, everyone's still up and running. Everything is working well. So far so good.
Interesting. You mentioned something about communication, internal communication. So, for example, in our country, there is a stream which existed, which probably was merged with HR for a very long time, but has come of age now, which is internal communication. And it has seen, a lot of inputs from PR agencies as well, a lot of asks from to PR agencies to be able to contribute towards internal communication. How has it been from you? Did your crisis communication also involve a lot of internal communication along with external, or was it just external?
It usually, if not always, but it usually has the element of internal communication. In many cases, for serious crisis situations, it's always very much present. It may not be an example from this year, but we've had several cases where you can't escape this step. You have to start with the clients, whatever you decide to communicate and whatever approach you decide to take, as long as you are considering your audiences, the first ones are always the employees. Because especially if you have a real crisis, and usually you do if you arrive at that decision, if you have that and if you don't have their back, then it's textbook knowledge. And apparently it really is that case in real life as well. If you don't have their back, then really everything else is a short-term solution, and the risks are extrapolating quite substantially. So for us, it's always been employees, partners, and then the more general public clients and so on. Because for our clients, in terms of bringing the messages across.
Understood. But typically it's always been during a crisis that people remember this, right? I remember when 5 years ago in our country, when we started pitching internal communications as a stream, a lot of them would come around and ask us, why do you want to do HR? An HR division with us. We have somebody who's doing all these internal parties and, wellness programs. And it was only during a crisis that they understood that, yes, we have to communicate internally. And that was usually as an afterthought, right? But now I think during the pandemic, it has made a point, right? People have begun to understand that internal communication is equally, if not more important as compared to external communication as well. We don't have to do that explaining anymore about it.
Yes.
Which has been
And I think that the crisis, or the pandemic situation that we have now, and that will be part of the new normalcy, is that we have to be honest about that. We will not have answers, and we will not be able to foresee all the risks and all the potential outcomes. Until now, I know we've done it as well, saying that, look, if you actually go through your business cycle, or if you go through your team and see how they're functioning, you should be able to foresee everything that's coming your way. So in essence, if you prepare for a crisis, it's hardly a crisis when it arrives. But I think this is something that 2020 has told us quite convincingly, that there are many things that may happen and many different outcomes of actions that may happen in the future where we cannot be as prepared as we used to be. But that makes it even more relevant that with those many unknowns, what you can do is at least you can have your team ready, and that's what makes the internal communication so relevant for everybody.
Absolutely. So, this is something that you mentioned during 2020, but because you also specialize in crisis communication, I think this is something that a lot of our viewers would like to listen to, is going back 12 years, right? What has been the biggest crisis that you've managed, and can you share your strategy about it with us?
The biggest one has been a very sensitive event that happened in Latvia, and a very tragic event. There was a department store or a shop, quite a large one, that collapsed in end of 2013, and
Okay.
54 people were killed, which is a huge number in Latvia, and in any case, it's a huge number. So that it was a national tragedy, and it had a huge impact on the whole industry as well. And our client was the company, the construction company, who was in charge of building the project. So, not to delve into detail, we in fact did what we just talked about. We set out to understand where the responsibilities of our client lie. What is it that they are, what is it that they've been tasked to do, and see and trigger all the so they kind of arrive at the checks and balances. So they arrived at a situation where they could pinpoint down the situations and the tasks that they had been tasked to do, what has been their responsibility and how they've done it, and to illustrate what is it that is their responsibility. And you have, in the construction process, everyone always thinks that you have, the company that is just putting bricks is the one that is there, but the process is very complicated, and there has been a court case going on, obviously, about that situation, and we have been at our client's side all the way, understanding what is it that they have been doing and how they've handled it from their direct business point of view. The first decision was by the court. The first instance of the court case was handed not too long ago, and the court has decided there has been no wrongdoing on the part of our client. But to make that journey, and that's exactly what we did. First, to clarify what is it that we're actually talking about, what is it that there has been their involvement, who have been the other players and their responsibilities in this process. Because you have the technical project creators and build it, and you have all the checks and balances system on behalf of the state and so on and so forth. And everyone's involved in that process. And we have been there with them the whole way. So the idea has been to understand that what is it exactly that we're talking about, and then it's that information process about starting with the employees, explaining what is going on, what has happened. Obviously, you have all the crisis media trainings that were initially conducted, but then planning for the long term, and also assisting in revising all the functions of the company, how it's done business, and what can be done better, and how to communicate these changes for the better, so that still, regardless of whether it is your direct responsibility or not, you can, as a company, contribute to making all the processes safer and all the processes more effective, so that nothing like that ever happens again. It's been a very challenging project, but that's definitely been also the most the most serious case that we've had.
Right. It's interesting to hear, that, like you're right when you say that we all need to be able to understand what the process is before you communicate as well, right? I'm sure it's going to be a very rewarding one at that as well, because you're helping create a change on an overall scale.
Yes, and it has. As a case like that, it always has an effect on legislation, on all the industry, on the industries, on everyone around, on the society at large, and so there are so many things to consider when you are thinking what information is relevant and what communication must go out, and where you should not refrain from saying, look, we need to do things differently, for example. So that, and obviously, and that's been the case for several industries in our experience, where you really it's not even only talking to the clients and educating them about how we do things and why reputation and communication is relevant in their case, but also sitting down and listening. And I think the listening part is usually the one where we tend to also kind of do shortcuts.
Correct.
So that's something that that is extremely important, so that we have that as much as possible, that in-depth knowledge about the industry that we're working with. And I think the golden rule is that we really need 6 months before you can do everything right without picking up the basic documents again on a daily basis. And it really, and there again, I think that will be the new normalcy as well. It will become more relevant than before, because with all the fake news, with all the information out there, with all the ability, with all the possibilities to, have interpretations that are not relevant. What you want to have is a team that is very agile, very well informed, and understands the process very well. And without that, you will be losing out. And I think we're in a good position to do that. That's what, kind of the idea behind having a team that can, for example, meet also on a PRBI level and work out, for example, any thoughts on how we address strategy issues or how we address crisis communication. What is it that certain level that a client in any country where PRBI is active can come to expect from us?
Okay, so I'm pulling you back to PRBI, leading on from that question. You've been a part of the network for some time now. How has the network benefited you? Have you done any collaborations with other members? Shared advice? Can you share some feedback on that?
Yes. We've managed to, our Estonian PR company, our partners in Estonia, we've shown them how PRBI operates, and I think everything was convincing enough. They joined PRBI last year, if I'm not mistaken. That has been very nice. So in terms of practical projects, we have worked with our German partner agency from PRBI, with Fomhof Communication, on a couple of projects. All of them have been excellent. We had a short, small project with our Polish agency from PRBI as well. But the most effective collaboration has been with Germany, and it's been also in several cases where we've asked our partners if for some advice depending on the market. We've done that in UK with Midnight Communications as well. We've done it with several others, and also in the US, because and this is again, we arrive at that international approach, that this is something we see that in many conversations also here at home. We can tell the customers, tell the clients that we can deliver many things that they would not expect from a boutique agency.
Correct.
And I think on a daily basis, that ability to lean on the network and be able to offer, even though you might not have that huge project coming your way right away, the ability to have that safety net is very valuable. And this is something that we've always come to expect to have. So that's a very, very good experience. Oh, and by the way, the projects in Germany, very successful. Our German agency does a brilliant job. We're very happy.
Awesome. That's really good to hear. And I've personally found the knowledge that, each one of them shares based on the experience is very, very rewarding. It gives perspective to any project or any client or any campaign that I'm working on. And it typically always ends up surprising the client. That you are not just to give them a local perspective or a national perspective, but also an international one along with it.
Absolutely.
We're running out of time. Last question, right? How do you balance your day? I'm sure you're also straddling between working from home, working from office. How do you manage it?
You have to say stop at some point. It's not exactly easy, but I think that, I need to build frames, and my frames stop at a certain point of time. So work is one part of the day. With running a company on top of consulting the clients, of course, you get, you have the second wave of work once all the kids are asleep, so you sit back down at 10 o'clock in the evening and redo the stuff that you haven't managed during the day. But
sounds familiar.
Yeah, I think that is relatable to many people around PRBI, for example. But one thing that, I mean, I think that word itself, the balancing act, I think it's very relevant on an individual level as well. And this means just pulling out the plug at some point of time and either, go hiking, which is not that possible now. But this is something that we're doing as well as a team. I mean, knowing how our team is working and how much effort they put into everything that they do. And they have been brilliant this year in making things happen and in staying ahead of the curve and doing the things that are necessary for changes to happen. This is something that we try to do as well, just to pull the plug together and take a Friday off if we can. It's funny enough, we went to my country house the other week and we did a tour in a part of Latvia just to have that moment and that pause. But funny enough, as soon as we arrived, half of my team, they sat down at the table, pulled out the laptops, and then started typing, replying to the missing emails. But thankfully, it took only about 40 minutes, and then. But as you say, I mean, it's impossible to do this if you don't take a break.
Completely agree. And I hope you get to do more visits to your country house and there are absolutely no laptops involved with it. Yeah,
that's an excellent plan. Next time we take away the laptops before we leave.
Yeah, so we've run out of time, but thank you so much for taking out the time today, sharing all your insights and helping us understand more about your market.
Thank you about the excellent questions. It was an excellent experience. Thanks again.
Thank you. Yeah. So that was a PRBI member, Juris Petersons, co-founder of Jazz Communication from Latvia, speaking to us about staying relevant in PR. And thank you again for joining us today for the session. We will see you again at our next live session with another interesting conversation from a seasoned PR professional from the PRBI network. Stay tuned.